Right now, I want you to do something a little strange with me. And I mean really do it. Not just imagine it, because there's a difference between thinking you understand something and actually feeling it happen inside your own body. Close your mouth, pick any comfortable note, and hum for about 10 seconds. Don't try to sound good. Don't try to control it. Just let it come out naturally. And while you do that, pay attention very carefully to where the vibration goes. Because if you're honest with yourself, you'll notice something that doesn't quite match. The simple idea that sound comes from your throat and stays there. The vibration doesn't sit politely in your larynx like a well-behaved guest. It travels, it spreads, it leaks into places you didn't expect, into your cheeks, up behind your eyes, across your forehead, and if you're really paying attention, there's a faint sense that the sound is not in front of you or outside you at all, but somehow inside your head, as if your skull itself has quietly joined the performance without asking your permission. Now here's the part that I always find fascinating, because the first time I noticed this, I didn't think, yes, sinus resonance. I thought something was off. Something about my intuition was wrong. And that's always a good place to be, because it means you're about to learn something real. You've spent your whole life thinking of your head as solid, as a kind of sealed container for your brain. But it isn't. Not even close. Your skull is full of cavities, hollow spaces carved into the bone itself. And these aren't defects or empty leftovers. They're structures with shape, volume, and physical behavior. And when you hum, you are feeding energy into that system. Whether you realize it or not, behind your cheeks, there are large air-filled spaces called the maxillary sinuses. And they're probably the ones you felt most strongly, because they're big enough to respond noticeably when you introduce a steady vibration above your eyebrows, in the bone of your forehead. There are the frontal sinuses, smaller, but still capable of resonating, and deeper still, tucked between your eyes and further back toward the center of your skull, are the ethmoid and sphenoid sinuses, which you don't feel in the same obvious way, but they're there, participating quietly, like instruments in an orchestra. You can't quite isolate, but that still shaped the sound. What matters here is not just that these spaces exist, but that they behave like physical systems, like little chambers that can respond to certain frequencies more strongly than others. And when you hum, especially when you hold a single note instead of constantly changing pitch the way you do in speech, you are giving those chambers exactly the kind of input they need to start resonating. And that's why the experience feels so different from talking, because talking never holds still long enough for anything inside you to fully respond. It's always shifting, always breaking the pattern before the system has time to build up any real amplitude. There's another layer to this that makes it even stranger, and it has to do with how the vibration actually travels. Because you might think it's just moving through air like any other sound, but a significant part of what you're feeling is moving through bone, and that changes everything. Vibration travels through solid structures much faster than through air. And your skull is not just passively containing that vibration. It's conducting it, spreading it across the entire structure so that multiple cavities are being driven at once. And that's why the sensation doesn't feel localized. It feels distributed, as if the boundary between where the sound starts and where it ends has been blurred. I remember once taking apart a simple mechanical system, nothing fancy, just a set of connected parts, and being surprised at how energy introduced at one point didn't stay there. It propagated, it found pathways I hadn't considered. And the whole system responded in ways that weren't obvious until you actually tried it. And your head, right now, is doing exactly that. except you've been carrying it around your entire life without ever being shown what it can do under the right conditions. And if you go back for a moment to that first hum you made, or you try it again now with a little more attention, you might notice that the experience has changed slightly. Not because your anatomy changed in the last few seconds, but because your awareness did, and suddenly what used to feel like just a sound now has structure, direction, depth, and behavior. And once you see that, it's very hard to go back to the simpler story you had before. The one where your head was just a solid container and your voice was just something that came out of your throat. Because now you've felt directly that there is a whole physical process happening inside you that you were never taught to notice. Now, if you stay with that sensation for a moment, not rushing away from it the way we usually do when something unfamiliar shows up in our own body, you can start asking a much more interesting question. Not what did I feel, but what kind of system produces that kind of feeling? Because once you ask it that way, your face stops being just anatomy and starts behaving like a piece of physics. And that shift in perspective changes everything. Because physics doesn't care about what you think something is supposed to feel like. It only cares about how energy moves, how it gets transferred, how it builds up, and how it dissipates. When you hum, you are not just making a sound, you are injecting a steady, continuous vibration into a structure that has very particular dimensions, very particular shapes. And those details matter in a way most people never consider. Because any cavity that contains air, bounded by rigid walls, has something called a resonant frequency, which is just a fancy way of saying that there are certain vibrations it likes. Certain frequencies where the energy doesn't just pass through, but starts to accumulate, to amplify, to bounce back and forth in a way that makes the whole system come alive. And your sinuses, those hollow spaces in your skull, are exactly that kind of system. Not metaphorically, but literally, they are physical resonators. You can see this much more clearly if you step outside your body for a second and look at something simple, like a glass. Because if you run your finger around the rim of a wine glass, it starts to sing. Not because you're pushing air through it like a flute, but because you are exciting a vibration that matches the natural frequency of the glass, and once that match happens, the energy you put in doesn't disappear. It builds, it reinforces itself, and the glass responds with a clear, sustained tone. And something very similar is happening in your face. Except instead of glass, you have bone. And instead of a single open cavity, you have multiple chambers connected through narrow openings, each with its own geometry, its own preferred frequencies. Now here's where it gets even more interesting, because not all sounds you produce are equal in the way they interact with this system. And this is the part most people completely miss. Speech is chaotic, constantly changing. Every syllable shifts the frequency, breaks the continuity, interrupts the energy before it has a chance to settle into anything stable. And singing, while more controlled, still moves from note to note, chasing melody rather than holding still. But humming, especially when you sustain a single note without opening your mouth, does something very different. It locks into a frequency and stays there, long enough for the cavities in your skull to actually respond, to resonate, to reach a kind of steady state behavior where the vibration inside them is much larger than what you initially put in. And the reason you feel it more strongly when you hum compared to when you speak isn't just about frequency stability. It's also about how the vibration travels. Because a large part of what you're experiencing is not traveling through air at all. It's traveling through bone. And that's a completely different pathway, much faster, much less damped, and far more efficient at delivering low-frequency vibrations directly into the structures of your skull, bypassing the usual route that external sounds take. And that's why your own voice sounds deeper and fuller inside your head than it does to anyone else, because you are hearing it through a channel that no one else has access to. I once tried a simple experiment with a piece of metal, just tapping it lightly at different points, and noticing how the sound changed depending on where and how I touched it. And what struck me wasn't just that it made different sound, but that the object itself seemed to prefer certain ways of being excited, certain inputs that made it respond more strongly, almost as if it had its own set of rules that I had to discover rather than impose. And your face, right now, is doing exactly that. It is revealing its preferences, its resonant behavior, not because you forced it, but because you happen to give it the right kind of input. So when you hum and you feel that vibration spreading through your cheeks, your forehead, and deeper into your skull, you're not just noticing a sensation. You're interacting with a physical system that has been there all along, quietly waiting for the one condition that most of your daily behavior never satisfies: a steady, sustained frequency that gives it time to respond. And the strange part is not that it works this way. The strange part is that you can go through your entire life using your voice every day and never once stumble into the conditions that let you notice it. Up to this point, you could still tell yourself that all of this is just about vibration, just about sound moving through bone and air, something interesting, maybe even surprising, but still safely contained within the world of acoustics. And that would be a comfortable place to stop, except the system doesn't stop there, because those cavities you've just been feeling, those sinuses vibrating quietly inside your skull, are not empty spaces in the passive sense. They are lined with living tissue, and that tissue is constantly doing chemistry, whether you pay attention to it or not. Inside each sinus, the surface is covered with a thin mucosal layer, and embedded in that layer are enzymes that continuously produce a gas called nitric oxide. And this is where the story shifts from something you can feel directly to something you normally cannot, because you don't have a built-in sense for gases diffusing in microscopic spaces. Yet the process is happening all the time, slowly, quietly. With each breath you take, nitric oxide accumulates in those cavities, building up at a modest rate. But the problem, if you want to call it that, is that the sinuses are not wide open chambers. They are connected to your nasal passages through very narrow openings. And those openings limit how quickly the gas can escape. So under normal breathing, most of what is produced just lingers there, diffusing out gradually, almost reluctantly. Now bring back the hum, not as a sound, but as a physical disturbance, because what you are doing when you sustain that vibration is not only exciting the resonance of the cavities, you are also creating tiny, rapid oscillations in air pressure inside them. And this matters in a way that is not obvious at first, because each oscillation is effectively pushing and pulling air through those narrow openings, turning what would otherwise be slow diffusion into something closer to a pump, a mechanical exchange process that actively moves gas in and out of the sinus chambers. The difference between diffusion and pumping is not subtle. One is passive and limited by geometry. The other is driven and can dramatically increase the rate of exchange. There was a moment when I first read about this effect, and my reaction was not immediate acceptance. It was skepticism, because it sounded almost too neat. That something as simple as humming could change the concentration of a biologically active gas in your airways. But then you look at the measurements, and they're not small. They're not marginal adjustments buried in noise. They show a significant increase in nitric oxide levels in the air. You exhale through your nose when you hum compared to when you just breathe quietly. And at that point, you're forced into a more honest position, which is not to jump to conclusions, but also not to ignore a measurable effect just because it came from an unexpectedly simple action. So now you have nitric oxide no longer sitting quietly in your sinuses, but being flushed out more rapidly, mixing into the air you were about to inhale. And that air does not stop in your nose. It travels down your trachea and into your lungs, reaching the alveoli where gas exchange with your blood takes place. And nitric oxide, unlike oxygen, is not there to be carried in large quantities. It acts as a signaling molecule, a regulator, and one of the things it does is influence the smooth muscle in the walls of your blood vessels, causing them to relax, to dilate, which in the context of the lungs means that the tiny capillaries surrounding the alveoli can open a bit more, increasing the effective surface area where oxygen can cross into the bloodstream. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is where people tend to get carried away, imagining dramatic effects, as if a short hum could transform your physiology in some extreme way. And that's not what the evidence supports. The changes are modest, subtle, but real, and the important thing is not that they are large, it's that they exist at all. That a small mechanical action in your face can influence the chemical environment of your airways and, through that, slightly alter the efficiency of a process as fundamental as oxygen transfer. If you've ever had one of those moments where you were humming absent-mindedly, not thinking about anything in particular, and afterward you felt just a little clearer, a little more awake, not dramatically different, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. It's very tempting to attribute that to mood or distraction or something psychological, because that's the story we're used to telling. But there is at least a plausible physical layer underneath that experience, one that doesn't require belief, only the interaction of gas, tissue, and pressure. And the unsettling part, at least for me, is not that this mechanism exists, but that it has been operating quietly the entire time, waiting for a condition that is so simple you would never think to test it seriously. And yet once you do, you can't quite go back to the idea that humming is just a sound you make when you have nothing better to do. At this point, you might still be tempted to keep everything in the realm of air, pressure, and chemistry, to treat what's happening as a kind of internal ventilation trick, something clever but still mechanical in a distant way. Except there's another layer sitting right in the middle of all this that doesn't wait for you to notice it, because it responds whether you understand it or not. And that layer is a nerve, a long wandering structure that runs from your brain down through your neck and into your chest and abdomen, touching organs you don't consciously control, adjusting rhythms you rarely think about. And the strange thing is that when you hum, you are not just influencing air or gas, you are physically shaking part of that system. The vocal cords that generate the hum are not isolated components. They sit in the larynx, surrounded by tissue that is intimately connected to this nerve, and when they vibrate, they do not vibrate quietly. They move rhythmically, continuously, transmitting mechanical energy into everything around them. And that includes the nerve itself, not as an abstract signal, but as a literal physical disturbance, the kind of input that nerves are built to detect through mechanosensitive channels, which open in response to deformation, turning movement into electrical activity without any need for you to decide that something should happen. I remember once thinking that most of what we call control in the body is really just interpretation after the fact, that the system runs first and we explain it later, And this is one of those situations where that idea becomes uncomfortably concrete, because you can sit there, hum a single note, and something begins to shift before you have time to assign a reason to it. Your chest feels slightly less tight. Your shoulders drop just a bit. The small tension in your jaw eases in a way that feels almost accidental, as if it wasn't waiting for permission. Part of that shift comes from the way this nerve, the one threading through your body, balances two modes of operation. One that prepares you for action, alertness, acceleration, and another that signals safety, recovery, slowing down. And the hum through nothing more than sustained vibration. Nudges that balance, not dramatically, not in a way that would make you suddenly drowsy or disconnected, but enough that if you were measuring something like heart rate, you would see a small consiste de change, a drop of a few beats per minute, accompanied by a subtle increase in variability, the kind of pattern associated with a system that is no longer bracing against the world quite as hard. What makes this particularly interesting is that the pathway does not depend on belief or attention in the way many relaxation techniques do, because those usually require you to follow instructions, to count, to focus, to maintain a pattern deliberately, and if your mind wanders, the effect weakens. But here the mechanism is embedded in the structure itself. The vibration is continuous as long as the hum continues. The contact with the surrounding tissue is unavoidable, and the nerve responds, because that is what it does when it is stimulated mechanically. Not because you told it to calm down. There's also something almost counterintuitive about the simplicity of it, because we tend to associate meaningful physiological change with effort, with discipline, with doing something correctly. And yet here you have a situation where doing less, not articulating words, not shaping sound, just holding a single note with your mouth closed, creates a more sustained and uninterrupted input than speaking or even singing, which constantly breaks the vibration into pieces, introducing gaps where the system briefly stops receiving that mechanical signal. I once tried to deliberately relax, sitting still, focusing on my breathing, attempting to let go in the way people often describe, and what I found was that the harder I tried, the more subtle tension I introduced, almost like the act of control itself was the problem. But when I accidentally started humming, not as an exercise, but as a kind of absent-minded behavior, the change came from somewhere else. Not from a decision, but from a process already built into the hardware. And that leaves you in an odd position, because it suggests that at least part of what you experience as calm is not something you generate through thought, but something that can be triggered mechanically, directly, through a vibration that your body interprets as a signal. It has been wired to respond to long before you ever tried to understand it. There's another piece of this that is so obvious, once you notice it, that it almost feels embarrassing to have missed it. And it has nothing to do with chemistry or nerves at first glance. It's just the simple fact that you cannot hum while breathing in. Try it if you want. It doesn't work. The physics of your vocal cords won't allow it. They require air flowing outward to vibrate, which means that every time you hum, you are extending your exhale, whether you intended to or not. And that one constraint quietly reshapes your entire breathing pattern without asking for your cooperation. Now think about how most people are taught to breathe properly when they're trying to relax. There are instructions, ratios, numbers to follow. Inhale for 4. Hold for a few seconds. Exhale longer than you inhale. Repeat the cycle. Maintain focus. Don't lose the count. And if you've ever tried to follow one of those patterns for more than a minute or two, You know that the difficulty isn't understanding the instructions. It's maintaining them without drifting off or subtly breaking the rhythm. Because attention is a limited resource, and the moment it slips, the pattern collapses back into whatever your body was doing before. But humming does something almost unfairly efficient because it removes the need for instruction entirely. The act itself enforces the pattern. When you hum, your exhale stretches out naturally, often 2 or 3 times longer than your inhale. Not because you decided on a ratio, but because the sound continues as long as the air lasts. And when the air runs out, you pause briefly, inhale, and return to the note, and just like that, you've created a breathing cycle that closely matches what clinical protocols aim for, without counting, without effort, without even thinking about it. What makes this more than just a convenience is the way the body responds to that shift in timing, because exhalation is not a neutral phase. It carries its own physiological signals. As the lungs deflate and pressure within the chest changes, sensors in the walls of blood vessels, particularly in regions like the aortic arch and carotid sinus, detect those changes and send feedback through neural pathways that influence heart rate, nudging it downward, gently reinforcing a state that leans away from urgency and towards stability. And when exhalation is extended, that signal is sustained for longer, giving the system more time to settle into that pattern. So now you have something interesting happening in parallel. The mechanical vibration we talked about earlier is still there, continuously stimulating tissue around the larynx, but layered on top of that is a breathing rhythm that is inherently biased toward longer exhalations. And those 2 inputs do not interfere with each other. They add together, each contributing in its own way to a shift in the balance of the autonomic system, not in a dramatic or overwhelming fashion, but in a steady, cumulative way that becomes noticeable if you stay with it for even a short period of time. I've seen people approach breathing exercises with a kind of determination that almost defeats the purpose, sitting upright, counting carefully, trying to get it right. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that it turns something that could be simple into a task that requires discipline, and not everyone has the patience for that, especially when they're already tense. But then you watch someone hum absent-mindedly, maybe while doing something else entirely, and without any visible effort, their breathing slows, their exhale lengthens, and the body begins to shift in the same direction those structured exercises were aiming for. What's striking is not that the outcome is similar, but that the path to get there is completely different. One relies on conscious control. The other emerges from the constraints of a physical system, and once you see that, it becomes difficult to ignore the possibility that some of the regulation we struggle to achieve deliberately might already be accessible through mechanisms we overlook simply because they feel too ordinary to matter. And if you pay attention to your own breathing the next time you hum, not in a forced analytical way, but just enough to notice the rhythm, you might find that it has already settled into something smoother, longer, less fragmented than your usual pattern, not because you fixed it, but because for a moment you stopped interfering with a system that seems to know exactly what to do when given the simplest possible condition. Now, it would be very easy to wrap this up neatly, to say that humming relaxes you, improves your breathing, maybe helps your circulation a little, and leave it there as a tidy conclusion. But that would miss something important, because the most interesting part of all of this is not the individual mechanisms, it's the way they overlap, the way a single, simple action ends up touching multiple systems at once. Some of them well understood, some of them only partially mapped. and some sitting right at the edge of what we can currently measure with confidence. There is one layer in particular that sits in that uncertain territory, and it has to do with pressure, not the kind you feel in your muscles or your chest in an obvious way, but subtle shifts in pressure that travel through connected spaces in the body. Because when you hum, especially with your mouth closed and your vocal cords sustaining a tone, you are slightly increasing the pressure inside your chest. Not dramatically, just enough that it changes how fluids and blood move through the vessels that connect your thoracic cavity to your skull. And those connections are more direct than most people realize. Veins that act like open channels. Transmitting pressure changes upward with very little delay. Inside your skull, your brain is not sitting in stillness. It is surrounded by cerebrospinal fluid, a clear liquid that cushions it, nourishes it, and moves in response to both your heartbeat and your breathing. And this movement is not random. It follows patterns, subtle oscillations that have been measured and studied, showing that respiration plays a significant role in driving the flow of that fluid through spaces around the brain. And once you know that, it becomes natural to ask what happens when you change the breathing pattern in a systematic way. When you extend exhalation, when you introduce resistance, when you create rhythmic pressure pulses, instead of the gentler fluctuations of quiet breathing, humming does exactly that. Not as a hypothesis, but as a mechanical consequence of how the vocal system works. The partially closed airway creates resistance. The sustained exhale maintains pressure, and the vibration adds a rhythmic component. So you end up with a pattern of pressure changes that is stronger and more regular than what you would get from passive breathing alone. And it is entirely reasonable, from a physical standpoint, to expect that this would influence how cerebrospinal fluid moves, how it oscillates, how it responds to the rhythm imposed by your own voice. But this is where it becomes important to slow down and be honest about what we know and what we are still inferring, because while the relationship between breathing and cerebrospinal fluid movement has been demonstrated, and while the mechanics of pressure transmission are well understood, the specific effect of a short period of humming on processes like fluid clearance in the brain is not something that has been directly measured in a definitive way. And the distinction matters not because it weakens the story, but because it keeps it grounded, prevents it from drifting into claims that feel satisfying but outrun the evidence. I've always found that the most valuable position in science is not certainty, but clarity about uncertainty. Knowing which parts of a system are solid and which are still under construction. And in this case, you have a set of mechanisms that sit on different levels. The increase in nitric oxide during humming is well documented. The shift in autonomic balance through extended exhalation and mechanical stimulation is observable and measurable. And then beyond that, you have these more speculative extensions, consistent with what we understand about physiology, but not yet confirmed in the specific context we're talking about. And when you put all of that together, something interesting happens to the way you interpret that simple act. You started with, it stops being just a relaxation trick, or a breathing exercise, or a curious acoustic effect, and starts to look more like a point of convergence where acoustics, fluid dynamics, neurobiology, and gas exchange intersect in a way that doesn't require special equipment, training, or even much intention. Just a closed mouth and a sustained note. There's a temptation to assign meaning to that, to elevate it into something more than it is. But I think the more honest reaction is quieter than that. It's the realization that your body contains systems that are already interconnected in ways you rarely notice. And every once in a while, you stumble onto an action that happens to touch several of them at once. Not because it was designed as a technique, but because the underlying physics allows it. And if you think back to the very first moment when you hummed without knowing any of this, the sensation you felt was already the result of those interactions. The resonance, the pressure changes, the neural responses, all of it was there before the explanation, and that might be the most unsettling part, because it means that understanding came after the effect, not before, and whatever just happened inside, you did not wait for permission, or even for you to notice